All right, so now we have the progressive era. Now, I have the dates in the 1880s to 1920. This is really a build up from the 80s and the Gilded Age, and the progressive era is trying to fix all that from the Gilded Age. Now, the Gilded Age was our first section. Second section we just finished was American in Transition, and I use that as kind of like that in between. The Gilded Age going on continues to go on. American transition changes the whole view of America and includes more of towards the frontier in the West, not just the East with the cities, which we typically think when we think Gilded Age. Progressive era kind of is designed to fix both of those, everything from the farmers to the workers. So let's get started with that. All right, so the farmers are having a tough time. Shortly after the Civil War, they're having overproduction, meaning they have produced so many crops. For instance, corn. Um, Supply and demand would tell you if you produce too much of one product, it's not worth as much. And that's exactly what was going on with corn and wheat. You had too much of it, so it wasn't worth that much. It is very high cost to operate and sell. Railroads are really charging unchecked, however they want. There's no rules, regulations. Farmers have to deal with that. And farmers are in great debt. And think about it. If you're a farmer and your crop's doing good, like corn or wheat, um, and you expand your farm, you take out a loan, and then all of a sudden your crop prices drop because of overproduction, not just you, but your neighbors and your neighbors' neighbors, you're in a lot of debt because of that. And then, of course, there's a series of natural disasters from floods to droughts to there's some amazing stories of insect invasions, including swarm of locusts that's just flying over the horizon where people thought it was a cloud. And it was just so many locusts that they're coming to eat all the crops. So there are lots of stories about that actually from this time period. So all these are natural disasters that farmers have to deal with and the before the turn of the century. One thing farmers can control, and they do get this idea, is they band together. They actually are going to first have these clubs where farmers meet up, discuss issues they have. One calls it the Grange Movement. And it starts off nothing more than just meetings of farmers. Eventually start cooperating together and it becomes what they call a co-op. And these guys, these farmers, are going to have enough influence to get laws passed, which is pretty impressive considering when we talk about farmers, we talk about maybe the Midwest, Ohio area, definitely the Great Plains. There's not a lot of people in those states in general at the time. So you can imagine how impressive it is to get laws passed for them, especially when most people are in the East, big cities, and they don't care about the farmers that much. And that's typically is the way they feel all the way up through the Dust Bowl. But we'll talk more about that then. But this is the Grange movement. Where farmers get together and discuss ideas, problems they're having. Eventually, they realize how the railroad's not charging each other fairly and becomes a big issue, and they want to get laws passed. And they're able to get some Granger laws passed. Big thing we talk about, and we already talked about this in a previous one was previous section was the Interstate Commerce Act. Remember that was a first government law, first time U.S. government's going to interfere in business. And this was why. It's because what the railroads were doing to the farmers. And the farmers were united behind this, and they got politicians to support that. Um, but we talked about in the Gilded Age section, but the Interstate Commerce Act is a pretty big deal. Okay, this agrarian movement eventually spawns into the Populist Party. It's the Grangers, but it's the farmers, it's farmers, the Grangers, and workers having some same ideas. This is called the Populist Party, sometimes called the People's Party, and this is the precursor to the Progressive era, progressives. So we remember where progressives came from, those ideas, they stem here with the Populists, aka the People's Party, and that was pretty much a common man against the big city guy or the big corporations. And when I say common man, I mean the farmer and the worker. When we talk about the platform of the Populist Party, what they believe in, you'll see how these can uh, be helpful for a worker in a factory and a farmer, how both of them can benefit from this. So this is a populist party, aka the People's Party. This leads up to the Progressive Party of the early 1900s. Okay. First thing we need to make sure you guys know is the unlimited coinage of silver. That's important. Okay. Often asked about when you look at our economy, our money. Currently, our money is based on Federal Reserve, and it's not necessarily based on anything. We control the print of money, how much it's worth. And when you get a dollar, it says Federal Reserve note. Well, it used to say silver certificate or silver note. One point in time, our dollar bills, our currency was based on gold. Now, think about it. Gold is more expensive than silver, right? So gold costs way more silver, and there's lots of gold around. Or there's not as much gold as there's not as much gold as there's silver. Okay, so if you got a ton of gold and then you got silver, okay, there's not much gold, so that leads to a little bit of money. Okay, if your money is based on gold, your currency in the United States, and we based on gold and gold alone, we can only print a certain amount of money, right? Just a little bit. But silver, there's a lot of silver, right? You know this because silver is worth less because there's so much more of it. So if there's less, silver's worth less, you're thinking, well, that's bad for economy. But here's the catch. Because there's so much more of it, you can print more dollar bills. If I'm printing more dollar bills, more people has access to those dollar bills. You know, silver is twice as cheap as gold. We're gonna have twice as much money in circulation as gold. I know what you're thinking. Oh, Mr. Brown, what about inflation? Inflation doesn't work if you have a set limit. So if our money is based on silver, once we print our money out, it has to equal to that silver. The only way we have inflation if we say, okay, a dollar now is worth half as much as it was before. It's really complicated, but in the sense, just understand this for this time period. Silver meant more money. If there's more money out there, then there's more for farmers and the common man. So farmers could pay back debt. So farmers and workers, they liked this idea. Money based on silver. It meant more money in circulation and more money for them. Because not a lot of people have gold. So not a lot of people have money based on gold. Okay. Another thing that I want you guys to know specifically for this box is a direct election of senators. This idea starts with the Populist Party. This eventually becomes the 17th Amendment, right? But it's going to take time before it gets that far. Essentially, our founding fathers, this was, I think, a serious flaw of the Constitution that didn't trust Americans to pick both the House of Representatives and the Senate. They chose us. They believed we could pick the House, but the upper branch, the upper chamber, the Senate, they didn't trust the Americans to make the right choices. So they gave that power to the state. So your state legislators, the guys you probably don't know who represent you, they would get together and they would pick the Senate. Now, think about it. If your Senate is picked by a bunch of people, most of them you don't know. Because even if you know your local one, you still don't know the other 200 guys in Texas that are part of the State House of Legislators. They're going to decide who it is. They have no say-so in it whatsoever. And there was a lot of corruption. Like people bought Senate seats. All they had to do was give enough House legislators money, and then they were picked to be a senator. And this is a Senate. They are the upper chamber in the legislative branch. They help pass, and enforce, not enforce, but help make and pass laws, right? So think about that. Like you weren't even choosing that. It was rigged already. So the People Party, Populist Party, were the first ones to introduce the idea, let's have an amendment that changes that. Because if you want to change the way the Constitution says we vote, we have to have an amendment to change the Constitution. So they wanted an amendment to where you direct elect senators, and they would eventually get that, but it would take years to go that far. This other stuff is interesting, but you don't need to know it for the test. Term limits for president, that was a good one, saying you're going to serve a single term, but that never comes to be. Secret ballot. You used to walk in and say you want a Republican or a Democrat ticket, and you had to pick one in front of everybody, and that's who you voted for. So it wasn't very secretive at all. But eventually that would happen, right? Now you're confident that if whatever vote you cast, you can do it private without being judged or intimidated, which was a big thing. A graduate income tax, that eventually will happen. We're going to talk about that. That's the 16th Amendment. We'll talk about later on in this chapter. A graduate income tax means the more you make, the more you pay in taxes. Government ownership of railroads. This railroads, telegraphs, and telephones. That's a popular idea we see today. You see, in modern times, we have the progressive movement now, another one. Guys like Bernie Sanders, they don't call themselves Democrat and liberals, they call themselves progressives. And that the policies aren't based on if I'm Democrat or Republican. Their parties are their policies, their ideas are based on does it help the working class, does it help the working man? Back then, it was the same thing. Government ownership of railroads meant if the government owned a railroad line or the railroads, the government would be non for profit. So they would charge you money for the railroad, but that money would go back to pay for the railroad and nothing else. There's no extra money kept. There's no billionaires making money off you. None of that. It went straight to workers in the railroad, whatever it costs to run the railroad, and so they wouldn't have to charge you as much. That was a great concept that they argue that the government should own that. Just much like there's a big push now for the post office to become a bank itself, where people get loans from the post office and have accounts, checking accounts through the post office. What that means is the post office can actually be self-sufficient. They have these options, these loans, but they charge just enough to pay for themselves, right? Pay for the workers in the post office, and pay for the loans, which means that their interest rates that they charge you and the fees they charge you wouldn't be near as much as Wells Fargo or Bank of America or Chase Bank, all those banks that make huge profits off you. The post office wouldn't have to charge you as much as them, which means you would have an option, a more affordable option, and also the government agency would pay for itself. That's what modern day progressives think. Back then, they thought the same thing. That never materializes. A lot of people argue that socialism, which we talk about later. Shorter work days of 8 hours, they wanted that to become a law. Immigration restriction with quotas. They don't want to stop immigration altogether, but the People's Party, the Populist Party, they did want to restrict it down. And that's because immigrants were seen as competition for labor. Okay, so now it's easy. I always tried to tie in stuff in modern times because it's easier for you to understand and see what the progressives were, right? Um, let's see the political power of the Populist and People's Party and how it became part of the progressives and how that just became part of politics in general. Because the Populist Party, aka the People's Party, doesn't last very long, right? Just a couple of terms. Let's take a look. Okay, so in 1892, in that election, the People's Party, aka the Populist Party, here they have a small piece of the pie, right? They do get some senators elected, and they do get 1 million votes for their president at the time, which is a lot for a time. So they do get some electoral votes. That's a third party doing that. Here's the deal: the Dems, who easily win, and the Republicans, right? 1896, the Democratic Party is going to nominate this guy, and you need to know him, by the name of William Jennings Bryan. He is known for this speech right here. Cross of Gold speech. Make sure you know that William James Bryan, Cross of Gold speech. Now, he's not a populist party, he's a Democrat party. But the Democrats realize, hey, the populists got a big chunk right there. Maybe we can get their votes. The Democrat Party adopts their ideas. This is what third parties do. Sometimes third parties can throw an election out the window. Sometimes third parties introduce ideas that the big parties will take and run with. In modern times, the perfect example would be the marijuana, legalization of marijuana. In the 90s, the Green Party pushed to legalize marijuana. Everybody thought they were crazy. And now look at this. It's 2020. Many states have legalized it, and it's a big push on a Democrat's ticket. Okay. In this case, William James Bryan is a Democrat Party nominee for President of the United States. He gives a famous speech, and in that speech, he tells the people that those rich people want to crucify America on a cross of gold. That becomes a cross of gold speech, and people are so pumped up they actually carry him out on their shoulders chanting his name. And nonetheless, that makes a populist vote Bryan. Populists and the People's Party, they're not going to run anybody. They're going to say, hey, this is our guy, William James Bryan. He's same stuff we believe. This time it's a major party running with the idea, and we've got a chance. So they're going to vote for him. Republicans pick McKinley, which we'll talk more about him. You don't have to stick around on him yet now, who's pro-business. And William Jennings Bryan's will lose. You need to know him for two things for STAAR test. This is the first thing, cross the gold speech. He does end up losing, but those ideas now are part of mainstream. Republicans and Democrats both are going to pick up some of these progressive ideas. So let's talk about some of those progressive ideas. I do want you guys to know the social gospel movement is this is like a root or some early beginnings of the progressive movement. It was wealthy Christian people who were behind this, and many Christians and Jews as well. Don't get me wrong. The social gospel movement was the idea that Christian Jews believed that it would be a sin not to stop human suffering. There's a point in time where Christians were actually like Christian, and they looked at this and said, "If I don't help out my fellow man, I'm being a bad Christian." And so it was the progressive ideas to help society and people better off was was a social gospel movement, and that Christians had a huge role in that, much different than you see modern times now. They also supported this idea of the temperance movement. You may have never heard that before, but that's when there's a ban on alcohol. No alcohol is allowed. That was fixing society, right? So when we talk about social gospel movement and being part of the progressive movement, it's a society part. Progressive movement included laws against corporations, big business, stuff like that. But it also has social issue, and alcohol was a perfect example. That was a push to make alcohol illegal. And historically speaking, when we look at the history of the world, let's go back to England's Industrial Revolution. When men start drinking, when you work at factories and they spend more money on alcohol inside the city and stop at bars, domestic violence takes off. You can almost argue it doesn't exist until we have alcohol. That's what many people believed back then. So these mainly women are pushing this temperance movement to end alcohol. You can see some of the those that support it here. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Right. Some of these cartoons you see here. Um, my father keeps the tavern. She's well off, nice. Um, my husband sends money at the tavern. She's pretty sickly looking, freezing, and the weather. Political cartoons to get you convinced when you vote. You know, hey, vote for a politician to make it a wet county, state, or United States. Wet meaning alcohol is allowed, and you're gonna help the rich fat guy. Or vote dry, make it a dry county, dry states, and you help the women, the mothers, the children who need it the most. So you can see the ideas behind that. This actually does eventually become an amendment. If you're wondering, yes, this is the 16th Amendment, will be prohibition, and that bans all alcohol. Now, this woman here is an easy way to remember temperance movement. You understand that it's actually women that push for this. That's Carrie Nation. You should just YouTube Carrie Nation drug history, and you see a historical, hysterically historical version of her. But she would go into saloons with her axe and chop up bottles. Now she got arrested, but she was always bailed out or she was let go because a lot of times she picked saloons that were in dry counties that weren't supposed to be open at all, but people just ignored those laws because Americans love alcohol. And so she goes chop those up, get arrested, and it's like, what are you going to try her for? You can't really put on trial for anything because that saloon wasn't supposed to be open. But she did with her hatchet there. She became pretty famous. She's the face of the temperance movement. You don't have to know her name for STAAR test. But when you're thinking, oh, temperance movement, who is that? That's Carrie Nation. That's who you think about. I do want to introduce this term just so you guys understand it. You've seen it used modernly quite a bit. There was an idea that the government take control of some of the basic industries, not all of the basic industries. That's dictatorship, communism kind of thing. But socialism was like, hey, some of the stuff you can't trust corporations to run because one, they're for profit. A lot of people make that argument now about our healthcare system. Healthcare in America is not that great. Although we pride ourselves on it, drugs are 60% more expensive. It costs you pay health insurance every month, and that you still have to pay a couple $100 to see a doctor. And we have deductibles. It's other countries look at it in confusion and awe at how bad it is compared to other countries, and we kind of see that really bad with the with coronavirus this year. But some people argue that hey, the government should control and regulate that. For instance, Canada, when medicine is sold there and first introduced in the country, there's a committee in the government, Canadian government, and they decide how much you're going to charge, the max you can charge for that drug. That way, it is affordable for all people. And if you don't like it, you can't sell your drug in Canada. And of course, your companies still make a huge profit, so still willing to do it to sell in Canada, right? But our healthcare system is run by corporations, is based on profit. So that's the main goal. So other people argue, hey, if the government took control of this, if we had Medicare for all or anything like that, then it would be affordable because not all about making a profit. That's not your number one reason. Socialism starts the same idea that hey, some of these basic industries we can't allow corporations to run. It's too costly for humans, for people. Okay, so that's just the idea of socialism to get started. You can debate that back and forth and talk about how crazy it is and stuff like that. And people do that, especially here in Texas, but we won't. Here you can see the drunkard process. You know, it's just social drink, parties, a little bit of violence, getting wasted here all the time. Then it's downhill, right? Poverty, right? And eventually you end yourself with a suicide, and you leave the wife alone with a child to run everything. This is a process of being drunk. So definitely a political cartoon trying to convince you of something, right? And here I'm introducing Upton Sinclair for the first time. I have him again next slide, and his book, The Jungle. When you actually read this, and I won't read this because you could on your own time, but he talks about how bad the meatpacking industry is. He actually wrote this book to show how tough it was as a worker. But when he wrote this book, he talked about how, think of the meat that you see for sale, or the meat that people cook with, or the meat that industries cook with. He talked about these meat packing plants. They literally just shovel the meat, threw it on the floor, put piles on it. Rats ran across it. Rats pooped on it. People lost fingers in the blades, and it fell into meat, and they still just packaged it right up. Um, the water they used to make the sausage, um, guys would wash their hands in that water and then go eat and then use that water when they made sausages later. Like it was pretty gruesome and actually pretty nasty when it came down to it. So it was pretty horrible. Upton Sinclair exposes the meat market industry for what it is. So much that Theodore Roosevelt later on will actually read this book and send agents and say, hey, is this true? And they say, yeah, everything he says is true and worse. And so Teddy Roosevelt will create laws against this. But this is how it all starts. It all goes to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle that exposed how bad the meatpacking industry really was. So in your notes, you'll see this. Upton Sinclair is the one you have to know in The Jungle. Know that's a meatpacking industry one. We talked about Jacob Riis already. He was the one that took pictures. The name of his book was How the Other Half Lives. These are what we call muckrakers. Muckrakers, some people call it muckrakers. I like to call it muckrakers because they rake up the mucks, trash, stuff like trash, nasty stuff. Those two are the big ones that we talk about quite often. You see these cartoons about people raking up the muck. This is Teddy Roosevelt. He's going to be our first progressive president. He's the one that tackles the meat industry issue. But these guys expose society for what's really going on. And these are muckrakers of their time. There's another muckraker I want to talk about. I have on a separate slide. It's Ida B. Wells. She's going to start an anti-lynching crusade, hoping to have an anti-lynching bill. Let me explain how bad lynching is. You see cartoons of old people are hung, they might be beaten, and they kind of make it a PG-13 version. No, this is horrible, especially in the South where they did African Americans. Men sometimes just get accused of just being in the wrong place, walking by, and they're beat up, strangled, stripped naked, mutilated, and like horrible things. It comes to mind when you think of lynching. One woman in particular, her husband was lynched in a town, and she wanted the local police to do something. Of course, they didn't. They were local white police. They took her, hung her upside down after beating her, cut open her, uh, cut her open. She was 8 months pregnant, and as the baby fell out, they stomped on the baby and killed the baby before she even died, and watched it happen as she hung upside down. So lynching was a horrible thing that's done throughout the South, and to skim over it like it was nothing, it should show you how bad it was when they couldn't even get an anti-lynching bill. It wasn't even illegal to lynch people. Even now, if you still think things are so much better now, keep in mind a huge chunk of states don't have a hate crime bill. If you're unfamiliar with that, a hate crime bill is if you commit a crime in the name of hate based on racism or anti-religious or something like that, you the penalty is far worse. Most states don't. A lot of states don't even have a hate crime yet. Hate crime bills. So I think we've gone pretty far from lynching. Yeah, we have, but not near as much as it was. Ida B. Wells saw her friends, three of her close friends, lynched, and she set out to get this bill passed. She was a muckraker herself because she exposed that. Other reformers, however, Jane Addams, she's not necessarily a muckraker, but she's a reformer trying to change society itself, a social reformer. She ran a settlement house. What is a settlement house? Think of a settlement house as like a community center for poor people, kind of like the YMCA. This is where they provide childcare. So if immigrants had to go to work and they had their children, instead of letting the children run the streets, you could take your children here. And usually, as women who couldn't get jobs as teachers or areas of man-dominated field, women would take care of the children. Um, they would do things from teach them daycare, that kind of type of thing, but they would also teach English and even to adults at nighttime. This became it's just like the YMCA's we have now. This is a community center for poor people. The most famous one in America at least was the Whole House, and that was the personal one she ran. And it actually started with one building, but it would expand greatly. Like if you actually look it up now, you can see it was several buildings. It's a huge city block. Um, but it was there to help immigrants when the government didn't. So Jane Addams actually saw this in England and duplicated here in America. And these are settlement houses, like community centers for poor people. The famous one was the Whole House. That was her personal one, but they end up in almost every major city in the U.S. Okay, when we talk about civil rights, typically people think of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, NAACP. Before that, 1900, 1920, we had a fight for civil rights. Slaves are free now. Now they're demanding equal rights. Two people you need to know about: W. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Du Bois, I want you to think of as the educated man. He is the founder of NAACP. He demanded immediate equality. Okay, he said blacks should fight. They should protest immediately right now. That was W. Du Bois, his viewpoint. NAACP is the National Association for Advancement of Colored People. It was created by him, seven others. Technically, we think there's a ninth one. There's a woman. Her name was kind of washed off the list, but nonetheless, it was specifically for that. And he demanded immediate protest, whatever we need, immediate equality. Um, think of Stanford, Harvard, that type of guy. Maybe you've seen pictures. He seems like the educated enlightenment type. Versus Booker T. Washington, who said, hey, African Americans should focus on gradual equality, job training, and be patient. He would go on to he pushed for vocational, if you know that word, vocational training and education. Modern times, we think academics. This guy, you think college degree, stuff like that. Vocational, Booker T. Washington was like a bricklayer or brick maker back then. Now we would say instrument tech, welding, stuff like that. That's vocational education. Booker T. Washington actually opened up a brick making factory in Tuskegee, Alabama. And he said, hey, once they see that we're part of the economy and we're important and they get used to having business with us, then we'll eventually get that equality. It takes time, but that's what we need to do and be patient. So these are two guys both fighting for African American civil rights, but both of these guys saw it entirely different, right? Both were African American. They both want more rights. They both were excellent writers and speakers, but they had two different viewpoints about it. One was a slow pace, eventually it would happen, and it was like now, now, now. Make sure you know that test questions always either the difference between the two or one in particular, but it's always on every single test. So there are progressive. Before we talk about progressive presidents, they were on a local level and a state level. Theodore Roosevelt was in New York City at the time. He was part of the House there. He pushed for changes. There were progressive governors that pushed for changes. These are some things that they introduced. Secret ballot we already talked about. That's an easy one. You should know that, right? But let's talk about initiative. I want you to think of petition. Okay, voters could directly introduce bills by getting a petition. So if we gathered 100,000 petitions, that means that we could introduce this bill to be voted on. So if I get 100,000 people to say, hey, we should end school on Fridays, boom, we present that. And now that we got that many people on this petition, it starts an initiative to start this to become part of a bill itself. So we can actually get a bill started instead of going straight to or just voting for our representative saying, hey, can you make this bill? And he does or doesn't. Like, we really had no direct control over what laws were made. The initiative gives us some control, gives us a way to start the petition. The referendum itself is when we would vote, and you would vote on the law. So I'm going to put vote on the law. And if you're wondering what I mean by that, keep in mind, for the most part, when laws are made, they're made by representatives. We vote for the people, and those people get together and they make laws. We vote for the representatives. We have what we call representative democracy, and they make the laws. But this word, referendum, was this idea that they would put these laws on the bottom of ballots. So you might go vote for the president and the governor and all that stuff in your normal election. At the very end, there's a question that says, do you vote yes or no on Proposition 281? And that proposition could be a local law. In most states, the most famous ones we know now, you guys probably have heard of, is marijuana. Colorado legalizing marijuana, that was Proposition 281, or California legalizing marijuana. That was at the bottom of the ballot and asked people, do you vote for this? That's a referendum. We can vote directly on the law. That gives us a lot more power in democracy, right? And then the last one is recall, which is a pretty easy one. Like, nowadays, you think of impeachment, right? You've always been able to impeach the president, but now with recall, we can do it to local governors, local judges, local senators. There's a process to get them out. Before, once they're elected, there's very little we could do until re-election came. But now there's a process for getting rid of those corrupt ones before it's over. So impeachment has always been part of the Constitution, but now it's on a local level with the recall. The thing you need to remember about all three of these is the key here is that they gave more power to the people. The people had power, right? Which means the people had democracy. The people had more say so. That's what's really important. There's a theme, like, it's all about us having more power in the government directly versus us choosing a representative for us. On tests, that's the way it's usually looked at. It's not just, hey, what's the definition of this and this? There's a theme to all of this. And the theme is that people have the power and democracy is increasing because people are actually choosing directly. Don't worry about party primaries that exist. Secret ballots get pushed for. It helps with intimidation, so people aren't intimidated for they vote for or attacked later for it. Direct election of senators is the 17th Amendment. I talked about that already. That is, again, a progressive amendment that gets pushed through. Here's kind of more of a boring side to things, but we do have the Pendleton Act and Civil Service Commission. I talked about this before, but there is a thing called spoil systems, where if I help a politician get elected, he pays me back by giving me a job, like head of the post office or something like that. I'm not qualified for it. I just help the guy. Okay, so big thing is with the progressive movement was trying to change the government as a whole. Now, this backstory to this laws actually happens because people are assassinated, because other people are mad they can get jobs, but the spoil system comes to a head. Spoil system was this idea that was actually, it goes back to Andrew Jackson, where if you get me elected and I'm president, I reward you by giving you a position in the government, maybe head of the post office. You're not qualified for that, but hey, you got me elected, so payback, you know? So it's kind of sad, but it's really like buying your spot. That was a spoil system. To the victor goes the spoils, that old saying you guys probably never heard of. Well, eventually Congress will pass the Pendleton Act. Pendleton Act created a Civil Service Commission, which in effect said, hey, you're going to take exams and jobs have to be based on merit. So no longer are all jobs just handed out to your best friends. I know in modern times you're like, hey, that still happens. Yes and no. Our perfect example is our past president. He gave a lot of positions to people he favored that he thought would be loyal to him, but they have to be approved by Senate. And in this case, the same party that the president was Republican, the party was Republican, and they approved everything. Both parties are guilty of doing this, but there is a policy, a process that should stop that. That wasn't until we had Civil Service Commission, and some will actually require exams. And it was supposed to get rid of that whole spoil system and that whole crooked, corrupt government. It was a progressive idea, right, to make things better. Now we get into progressive presidents, and first one we talk about is Teddy Roosevelt. Um, he became president by technically by accident. He was vice president. President was assassinated, and he took over. He probably never would have got either nomination from Republicans or Democrats because what he believed didn't align with the big parties. He was very progressive. He said president should be manager for the people. Perfect example was how he ended the coal miners, should be miners, not mentors, miners' strike of 1902. He brought owners to the White House and threatened to use soldiers to work the mines if the owners didn't give in. And at one point, he actually told somebody that he wanted to throw the owners off the balcony in the White House. That's how upset he was because they were not helping out. They were not cooperating. They were being relentless. And Teddy Roosevelt was worried because without coal and winter was coming, it was going to be pretty bad in the North. So he stepped in and fixed that. And this rarely happens, especially in the case where the government never sides with workers. The government at this point in time, and even now, you can make the argument, government really sides with the property rights of the owners versus the workers' rights. And we see that throughout U.S. history. The government really interferes on behalf of the workers. It's usually on behalf of the property owners. But Teddy Roosevelt was one of those progressive presidents that believed in doing that. He was also known as a trust buster, which isn't often asked about on our state tests or anything like that. But just so you understand, cartoons like this, if the trust, aka monopoly, remember, that's just a fancy word for monopoly. If the trust was a bad one that took advantage of people, made money, and stopped competition, he ended that trust. He used a Sherman Antitrust Act, if you remember that, to end that trust. If they were a good trust and it helped people out and did good things for people, he just kept his eye on it. You see, the leash here says restraint. He just made sure it didn't get too far out of control. Have you ever seen Teddy Roosevelt? I'll tell you the story, next section of Teddy Roosevelt as a avid hunter and why he's always seen with teddy bears or bears themselves and why he's called Teddy Roosevelt. But this is Theodore Roosevelt as president. Very progressive in his laws. But we'll talk a lot more about him in the next chapter. Before we get to the next chapter, we talk about him as far as a war hero and his politics. We're just kind of hitting on his progressive ideas right now. These are three big ones you have to know. The Meat Inspection Act means the government's going to come in and inspect the meat at the meat markets and eventually even restaurants. These are some of the guys who work in fast food. The Meat Inspection Act allows the government to do that. And he also passes the Pure Food and Drug Act. You guys might know this now as FDA. And they're going to regulate the food and make all the requirements. Hey, if people get fast food, you guys know this. You have to have this food chilled for this many hours. You can't have it outside the freezer at this much time. You have to wash your hands before you go back to work. He did that because he read the Jungle by Upton Sinclair, and he was disgusted by it. Sent 2 agents out to test it to see if it's true. They came back and said it's true and it's actually worse than what we think it is. And so he was the one to push the FDA, the creation of the FDA Food and Drug Act. That's why they have to label allergies on food, all the ingredients on the food. They have to be honest and they can't lie about it. Government's going to step in and regulate that. That's a progressive idea. There's also conservation. This is a concept Teddy Roosevelt doesn't get a lot of credit for because he doesn't really pass laws. Eventually, they create the National Park Service. But Teddy Roosevelt, his background, I'll tell you more about that in the next chapter, is he's an outdoorsman, very much so. And he appreciates the outdoors. And he started cornering off land in America that the government owned and decided, hey, we're not going to build on this land. We're not going to dig coal. We're not going to dig silver or anything like that. This is going to be protected areas. He's conserving the area, protecting it. This is a conservation effort. No laws were passed yet, but and the reality of it, he's credited with actually doing this, cutting off these pieces of land and saying, hey, we're going to protect this national forest. And eventually, they do this at local levels too. And you'll have like city parks and stuff like that. Like Central Park in New York, that green area in the middle of all those buildings, that's how you started. So it was not just a progressive president, local ones did it too, but that idea is called conservation. Eventually, we do see the National Park Service created by Wilson later on, but the idea actually really does start with Teddy Roosevelt. Well, I told you Teddy Roosevelt took over presidency when McKinley died, was shot in office. Um, so Teddy Roosevelt took over, and then he ran one term. He ran for one term, won that term, ran it, did it. He could have kept going. There's no law in 1909. There's no law against that, but he chose to step down and said, "I'm done." But when he left, he picked somebody to pick up to finish his policies, to pick up with the same ideas he had. And so we have Taft here pointing to, Teddy Roosevelt here pointing to William Taft. Um, and once Teddy tells everybody, hey, this is the guy to go with, you should listen, Taft gets elected pretty easy. Taft is always shown as a fat guy. Supposedly he got stuck in the bathtub at the White House. He is a bigger guy. And those bathtubs were pretty small back then. But nonetheless, Taft is supposed to take over for Teddy Roosevelt. You can see this cartoon to the right. Teddy Roosevelt is dressed for a safari. He is an avid hunter, and he leaves the presidency to go on like a 2-year safari hunt in Africa. He actually leaves that. I mean, you can see he's leaving behind his policies to Taft, who's supposed to continue on what Teddy Roosevelt had started, those progressive ideas. But Taft fails miserably. Taft would go as far as to actually sell some of that land that Teddy Roosevelt had cornered off because it wasn't a law yet. He just did it. He just personally said, "I'm cornering this off. Let's not sell it." Taft actually went so far as to touch that. When Teddy Roosevelt comes back from his safari, he's pissed. That's it. I'm running for president now. But Taft is running as a Republican still, and the Republican Party does not like Teddy Roosevelt. He's too unpredictable. They're going to stick with Taft. Um, Teddy can't run as a Democrat. Democrats picked Wilson, Woodrow Wilson to be exact. So Teddy comes in and he's the independent, and he's going around, he's giving speeches. He's running as independent. He's got Taft with his old party against Wilson and the Democrats. Teddy's actually uh, going across the nation by railroad to give speeches. He's actually going to one area, upstate New York, I believe. He gets off the train and he heads up to the stage where he's going to give his speech, and he's shot right there. Gets up after being shot in the chest, gets to his feet, climbs the stage, stands in front of the crowd, says, "I don't know if you know this, but I've been shot. But it takes more than a bullet to kill a bull moose." And he continues to give his speech. And ever since then, it will be known as the Bull Moose Party. Now, if you're thinking, whoa, 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 you can't shoot and still move on, he did that. But it's a few circumstances. One, it's a very small caliber bullet. It's a 25. If you know anything about bullets, 22 is pretty small. A 25.25 caliber is even smaller. But still, the bullet with gunpowder should have pierced him, and it did. It actually pierced him, it did go into his body. But the reason why it didn't go too deep into his body and do serious damage is because he had that 2-hour speech rolled up, stuffed in his breast pocket. So when the shooter shot him in the chest, it slowed it down enough where it barely pierced him. And he did bleed, and he did go to the hospital after that, and they actually left it in him. It was better just to leave it in him. So he dies with that bullet in his body, interesting enough. But he's known as Bull Moose Party. And nonetheless, he doesn't win the election. Unfortunately, Teddy doesn't. But he takes the votes away from the Republican Party, who put Taft up again. Essentially, when the Republican Party splits, the Democrats are the larger one, and Democrats win. And they have Woodrow Wilson. He'll be the last progressive president. He'll get a few things done under his tenure. You have the income tax, the 16th Amendment, which we talked about before. And he also gets a Federal Reserve Act to pass, establish a Federal Reserve that will print our money supply and control our money supply, pretty much through loan regulations. Wilson also would create the National Park Service. I know what you're thinking, oh, that's not fair. Teddy had that idea. Yeah, Wilson ran with it, and Wilson was, even though he was a Democrat, doesn't mean he wasn't a progressive. At this point in time, political party lines weren't drawn so deep, and everybody was progressive because it was a good thing to be, and it would be hard not to support them. So even though he's a Democrat, Wilson still has a progressive agenda, just the same. All right, finally, we have essentially the last amendment. It comes while Wilson's actually president. He helps get is pushed through. But the women's suffrage movement actually goes back as far as Seneca Falls, where the women meet up. Susan B. Anthony is key in this, so you have to know that. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, even Alice Paul, which most textbooks don't talk about. Uh, these women are really key, and the struggle they go through to get women to right to vote for decades is unreal. And it finally sees the light, the 19th Amendment being women's suffrage in 1920. Technically, it's passed 1919, but it's ratified by all the states in 1920. It's the final progressive amendment. If you get a chance, you should watch this. Just YouTube Lady Gaga's Bad Romance remix. And it's a really well done video, but they take a Lady Gaga song, Bad Romance, and they apply women's suffrage to it, change the words up a little bit. And it has a lot of cool, interesting stuff, just like how in Congress it passed by one vote, and that one guy who voted for the amendment looks at a note passed from his mother that said, "Remember, let the ladies vote," kind of thing. And that's even in there. Then he goes on to the states, and states ratified. Then we talked about Alice Paul, how she's thrown in a mental institution, straitjacket. So it's it's a pretty interesting video for intent purposes. But nonetheless, this is our progressive error. Like we have four amendments: the 16th income tax, right? We have the 17th, the senators, direct election of senators. We have the 18th, which is prohibition, banning alcohol. And then you have the 19th, being women's suffrage. Again, all these were ways to make society and the government better. And this is the progressive amendment, the progressive error, essentially, in a nutshell.